Our next session is going to be a global look at diversity and inclusion. I'm going to introduce the two speakers for this session. Eugene Ho. Eugene is a partner in Verrill's business law group, where he counsels companies in all stages of their development, from startup through acquisition. He values his role as a trusted advisor and seeks to provide practical legal advice to all of his clients, taking into consideration their businesses and other objectives. He's the immediate past president and current board member of the Asian American Law Association of Massachusetts, and also a member of the board of directors of the Asian Community Development Corporation. Now, in your programs, Regina Hurley is our second speaker, but we have Nadine Peters has graciously offered to step in. Regina was unable to be here this morning. Nadine is a partner at Verrill, where she advises academic medical centers, health systems, health plans, and research organizations, as well as biopharmaceutical, it's a mouthful, device and technology companies on healthcare regulatory issues. Before joining Verrill, she was Deputy General Counsel at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and before that, she was a partner at Hogan Lovells in the Health and Privacy Information Management practice groups. She also served as an attorney at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and is a Leadership Council on Legal Diversity Fellow alumnus. I'm going to turn the program over to Eugene and Nadine.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for having us. So to begin this discussion, Nadine and I thought it would be important to sort of set the stage, talk about first why diversity matters, then talk about how we're doing as a legal profession in terms of diversity and inclusion, and then pivot to sort of what we've done at Verrill to address diversity and inclusion, and some of our success stories. So let's just dive right in. So we talked a little bit about this, the panel before talked a little bit about this before, and this is sort of why diversity and inclusion matters, right? Diversity and inclusion, beyond being the right thing to do, as Tommy said, is good business. And we heard a little bit about anecdotally how the various companies have made their business cases, but I think it's interesting to look at numbers. So the studies have shown really time and time again that as it says, diversity is good business. So in 2015, McKinsey did a study of, I think, 366 public companies in the US, the UK, Canada, and Latin America. And McKinsey looked at sort of financial performance and sort of the composition of the top leaders in those organizations and how diverse or not diverse they were. And what they found was quite interesting, I think. So companies that were in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity, they found were 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry averages. And companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to outperform their respective competitors. And also the reverse was true. So companies that were in the bottom quartile for both gender diversity and ethnic diversity were less likely to perform as well as their competitors, which is to say they weren't only not leading, but they were also lagging, right? And in the U.S., I found interesting that the study found that there's a true linear relationship between racial and ethnic diversity and better financial performance. So for every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity on leadership teams, the company's financial performance rose a certain percentage. So they were doing it by earnings before interest, and it rose 0.8% for every 10%. And I also found interesting that sort of the comparison between sort of ethnic diversity and gender diversity. And in the U.S., as well as these were sort of the global numbers, the study found that racial and ethnic diversity had a stronger impact. And the authors of the study suggested in the U.S. the reason why this may be the case is because sort of longer and more sustained efforts to increase gender diversity on senior management teams have been in place. So maybe those have already yielded positive results, and so these numbers were reflecting that. And interestingly, in the UK, the numbers were reversed. So gender diversity was a bigger impact than racial and that ethnic diversity. So, obviously, while correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, I think what this does show is that when companies commit themselves to, having more diverse leadership, they're going to be more successful. And I think we've heard a lot about why that's, anecdotally, why that's, intuitively makes sense, right? Deeper talent pool, better customer orientation, as National Grid was talking about, we're coming from National Grid. Employees are better and able to collaborate with one another, and just as we've heard about sort of decision making, more diverse views, more dissent, better problem solving, and this also shows to me that I think other types of diversity would also improve performance, right? Whether it's orientation, disability, other types of diversity is going to make your company perform better financially. And then sort of from a law firm perspective, a big thing that has been happening is that we've been receiving a lot of pressure from clients, to staff and teams with diverse members, and to have real impact on the levels of diversity and inclusion. And this was an open letter from about 170 companies earlier this year, GCs from some pretty big names and some smaller names, from Google Fiber, Etsy, Heineken, Chobani, Lyft, et cetera. They wrote an open letter to private law firms and basically said, we're going to direct our spend to those firms that manifest results with respect to diversity and inclusion. So this is something that really, with respect to law firms, hits the bottom line, and I think that's important to know. And one thing that we've also noticed from our clients is that not only do they care about sort of the numbers, right, in the sense of how many folks in your firm are diverse. Part of it too is making sure that they're doing the work with respect to that client. So some clients we have will, before they will pay their bill, will make sure that you fill out a survey that shows the hours and the team members that worked on that project. And so that's, again, just another pressure point that we're feeling from our clients. So sort of despite the good business case and sort of pressures from clients, I think what's telling is sort of where we are as a profession. And basically, I think that the legal profession remains one of the least diverse professions. And earlier this year, now published some new numbers about equity partners that I think are telling. So I think this is sort of a limited data set, right? Because we're talking about private law firms. We're talking about, so we're not talking about government lawyers. We're not talking about in-house lawyers. It's also, we're talking about equity partners, right? Which is only a part of the pipeline and not, it's hard enough to make any type of partner, let alone equity partner. But I think it's telling sort of what these numbers can show, in part because they're statistically significant. So 65% of partners in the NALP directory are reported in these numbers. And also, they've been doing this study for a number of years. So we can see trends, if any, from these numbers. And so what they basically found was that, there have been clear improvements. The numbers are better, but, it's they're incremental improvements, and really slow gains. And so what this chart shows is the distribution of all partners by equity status. So in other words, of all partners, how many of those partners that were male were equity partners? So, this basically shows from 2012 to 2018, 51.4% of partners that were male were equity partners, and that sort of fell to 46.2. For women, it rose from 9.3 to 11.2. And then for minority equity partners, it went from 2.9 to 3.8. And one thing to note too with this is that, you know, the increases in the minority partners and the increases in the women partners don't necessarily equate to the decrease with the male equity partners. That's because basically there are fewer equity partners now than there were. So what does this show? I think it shows clear movement, but only tiny increments. You know, equity partners in multi-tiered law firms continue to be disproportionately white and disproportionately male. Overall, just 1 in 5 equity partners are women, and 6.6% were racial ethnic minorities. Among non-equity partners, the numbers are better. Still not great, but better. 69.5% of non-equity partners are male, 30.5% are women, and 10.7% are racial and ethnic diversities. So signs of change, right? But I think it probably comes as no surprise to most folks that there's still much to do. I will say, and I don't know, Nadine, what your experience has been, but anecdotally, at least among the bar that I'm most affiliated with, which is the Asian American bar, we have noticed within the last 1 or 2 years a distinct improvement in terms of elevating senior associates to partners. This is mostly on the non-equity side, and I think it's going to take time to go sort of through the whole pipeline. It's a very complex issue, but when I was involved first with the Asian bar here in Massachusetts, I can, the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, I can think of maybe 1 or 2 folks that made partner of any kind, and I want to say in the last year or two, first of all, I had a good friend that just made partner on Monday, and then just overall, we've probably had 5 or 6, which, I mean, it's not but in a bar that's relatively tight, that's a significant achievement for us. So, let's see what else next here. So Veril, and then what we've done and what we've some of our success stories.
Yeah. So, while Veril is this actually a small firm, kind of as the chair, I think, right, asked about kind of how to apply some of this. I think some of what we talk about today may actually be responsive because Veril is a Portland, Maine-based firm with a Boston office and also an office in Westport with about 130 lawyers. So mid to large size. And so I think there's a success story to tell here, but I don't want to make it sound like we've resolved all the issues. But I think it's important to focus on where you can make progress and achieve readily available targets and objectives. And so I would say that Veril, as the slide notes, has been recognized as a leading firm for gender diversity. And part of that is that Veril took deliberate steps towards a gender diverse professional workforce starting in the mid-1970s. And as a result, has had a strong record of attracting women. It elected its first female managing partner in 1992, a woman named Judy Coburn. She had previously served as department chair and a member of the firm's executive board after being hired in 1980. So moved very quickly through the ranks. And I think that has shaped the culture at Veril Dana. It's something that it is proud of and kind of views as its identity. Currently, as you'll see from these statistics, about 40% of the attorneys at the firm are women, and more than half of the female attorneys at Veril are partners. And I think even more important is that 3/4 of female partners at Veril are equity partners. So there's a lot of representation at the executive and leadership levels at the firm. And the other statistics that's really important here is that our executive board is majority female-led, with 3 out of 5 board members being women, including the board chair, who is Regina Hurley, who I'm speaking for today in her place. But she is resident in our Boston office. She's also chair of the family law group practice at our firm and chair of the executive board.
I think
Yeah,
what's
go
important.
ahead.
I think what's important to note is also that the e-board those are elected positions.
Absolutely.
So that's the equity partnership making these the specific choices.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think a nuanced point, because other like department chairs and committee assignments and posts are often appointed by the managing partner or a body, and I think executive board or comp committee, there's some bodies that are actually voted by the equity partnership, and so I think it shows movement that the equity partnership has recognized 3 out of 5 as leaders as electing them as women attorneys at the firm. So, yeah, and I think the other final point on this slide is that the high representation of women in these important leadership roles really does shape the culture at the firm. It's something that is visible. It gives other women a clear, just very visible pathway to how you can be successful and have a long-term career at the firm. And I think that really does help with both attracting women and retaining women. So I'm gonna change the next slide. But notwithstanding that success, I think the firm is always striving to continue to be a leader in that area, but also striving to improve diversity more broadly. There's a standing committee, the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. In addition, in 2012, the firm named a diversity task force, which had a charge specifically of providing greater value to the firm's clients while improving attorney performance, increasing each attorney's ability to thrive at all levels of the firm, increasing diversity, reducing attrition, and identifying and eliminating conscious and or unconscious bias. And that task force is one of its first things, basically worked with an independent consultant and looked back. It surveyed, looking back 10 years, particularly women attorneys who had left the firm, to identify the reasons they left. And really we're trying to do some assessment as to what may be barriers to retention. Despite having good numbers on that score, I think continued to be concerned that there was some attrition. And got a remarkable 96% response rate. What they found, some of it was not surprising. It's some of the same mentorship, sponsorship things you hear at other firms. I think also notable was that there are pockets and kind of inconsistencies across the firm and group in terms of where some women felt that there was more of a still old boys network and kind of a workaholic culture that was not compatible with what the broader firm's messaging was around work-life balance and reduced hours policy. And so how to address the inconsistencies within the firm. And so, as a result of that survey and kind of look back, the task force made recommendations, and there were improvements made to both the mentor and associate training programs, modified the leave and reduced hours policies. And I think someone on the panel referenced this before. I think when you're the leaders of the firm, whether they're practice group chairs or equity partners, are availing themselves of those reduced hours policies and have reduced hours schedules, it makes it acceptable for more junior attorneys to feel like they can avail themselves of that as needed for their personal situation. And I think what is really important, I think part of what the modifications were, is making it clear that you are not automatically taken off partner track if you avail yourself of those policies. I think you're evaluated based on the skills you've attained, the same criteria, and I think that's something that also is meaningful. So that's kind of one of the first initiatives that the task force undertook. I think it continues to look at the firm's various programs around hiring, mentoring, associate development, compensation, associate review, and just day-to-day practices to identify and try to address other barriers to a diverse and inclusive workforce. So that's kind of another group within the firm. And Verrill does not have a chair or a chief diversity officer at this point. Again, we're a smaller firm. I think this was the approach that they have found has been effective now. I think that, again, there's no kind of one way to do this, and it may be that there's a demonstrated need for that, and that's kind of the next phase. But I think the task force has been effective in addressing some of the early issues that were identified. The other point on here is the Affinity Bar Associations and Community Support. I think that affinity bar associations can be a real help to improving diversity within organizations. To the extent you have diverse attorneys who are participating in those associations in a leadership role, supporting them and their roles on those associations, whether it's small things like making your offices available for their meetings and giving them time to pursue those activities, to really putting money behind it, supporting and funding as sponsors their events and other things. I think Eugene has been particularly active, so I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, this is
add a few
something.
comments.
Yeah, thanks, Nadine. This is something that I'm pretty passionate about, and I think because of how much it's helped my career, I think Affinity Bars and supporting financially and just encouraging younger attorneys in particular to participate in bar associations is sort of an underappreciated way that I think firms can sort of support diversity in the legal profession. When I got involved, so I didn't go to law school here in Massachusetts. So but I am from Boston. But as a lot of minority lawyers, I didn't know anyone growing up that was a lawyer. The only one. I am the only one in my family that's a lawyer, and so I didn't have that network, and so I thought it was important for me to start going out and meeting people. And one of the ways I started doing that was through my Affinity Bar, the Asian American Lawyers Association, and basically been involved my entire career, and still sit on the board. Was president of the organization from 2015 to 2017. Ingrid as well was former president of Allum. And just through that, just met a lot of people, and it really helped my career. I mean, the first couple events I went to were incredibly awkward. Just going and sort of not knowing anybody, and it's. So I have kind of a funny story, if you would give me a second. So Jeff Y of our office, who's now a partner of mine, is a mentor of mine, and he tells this story to others about me, which I don't know if that's a great thing, which is funny in retrospect. But basically, when I first met Jeff, wasn't at all in Massachusetts, but it was at a community event, and he was at the time, I think, the general counsel of the Department of Telecom in Massachusetts. I was a first-year lawyer at Goodwin Proctor, and I was just super excited to meet him because just to see someone of that seniority sort of involved in the community, and so I'm just chatting with him. It's like we're talking for like 10, 15 minutes, and he tells me that, and this is what he tells people, that of 14 of those minutes, he was just trying to get out of that conversation, right? Because I guess I was awkward or boring or whatever it was, right? But the point is that he's now a mentor of mine, a very big mentor of mine, and I just started building a lot of relationships by just going to these events and continue to go into these events, and I think Affinity Bars just have, and it doesn't have to be an Affinity Bar, it can be any sort of bar association, but I think what these organizations can do are really, I guess, three things if I put them in buckets, right? One is just general networking. I think we all know that this is a relationship-based business, and just knowing people, is going to help you, and your reputation is just going to carry, throughout your career. So knowing people, from outside counsel to referral sources to potential clients is going to be important. And then a subset of that, I think, is the mentorship piece. So there was actually a study done in 2017 by Yale Law School and a circuit judge, Judge Liu, in California, looking at sort of Asian Americans in the legal profession and sort of how they were doing. And one of the things that it found that that's no surprise, but that what people were saying that was a big impediment for career advancement was mentorship. And so I think through these Affinity Bars, that's just another source of folks for you to meet in order to get mentors, because I think that's the big piece of how a young attorney sort of develops their career. And then lastly, which, I don't know if I ever appreciated as much, was sort of leadership, because these affinity bars give you a lot of opportunities to sit on committees and sit on boards and, lead an organization and see how to deal with relationships, how to deal with different perspectives. And particularly as a business lawyer, just to see how boards interact was very important. So, so that's just something that I think it's important for firms to do, support, financially, and support their attorneys to attend these events.
Yeah, and I can just add on to your comments, Eugene.
Sure.
I'm not sure if there are others in the audience who are familiar with the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity, or whose firms or organizations may be members. But it is a private organization put together, and it's it's a membership organization of managing partners from law firms and general counsels of large corporations, and with an emphasis of identifying future leaders among their diverse lawyers at their organizations, and to put them in a situation where they're creating relationships and hopefully impacting what the legal profession looks like in the future. And I think each member organization each year nominates attorney from their firm who is at kind of either, approaching advancement or just been advanced on the law firm side, and on the in-house legal department side, someone who's been successful, maybe moving into a role where they're managing people in a managing counsel role, in a more supervisory role, or approaching who would like to be in a general counsel role someday. And the programming is basically there's not a lot of it. The goal of it is to create relationships and match early career law firm partners who may not have the network to build a practice with in-house counsel who similarly are going to need to be looking to hire outside counsel. And the whole goal isn't to just get business. I think it's really to establish these relationships so that as you each grow in your respective careers, you have made those connections early and will have some impact. And I was a beneficiary of that. I was my former law firm at Hogan Lovells as a member, and was the first fellow they put up in 2012. And it's a really dynamic organization with people doing a lot of great things. But I think what I take from that is that a lot of times, as Eugene mentioned, there's been a lot of progress just within the past couple of years of firms advancing more diverse classes. Typically, many firms have 2 tiers of partnership, though, and so that's non-equity partners. And I think while there's been improvement there, the equity partner still lags. And what the barrier to getting from non-equity to equity partner in a law firm is really about your business case and your business development, and how to put that together as someone who has succeeded well, been in a superb associate such that you're recognized to be a partner. Then when you become partner, then what? And you can't rely on the same skill set that got you there, because you can't just put your head down and do your work really well and have good interpersonal relationships. You really have to figure out how to build your practice and distinguish yourself from your other partners in the group or across the firm. And I think continuing to support those diverse attorneys who have invested in and may seem like they've made it, that's when you don't want to lose them. And so I think continuing to think about how to support their business development and kind of building a practice is an important thing for firms to think about that they may lose sight of, even though they're doing really well on the front end of the pipeline problem. So yeah, I think groups like LCLD, Affinity Bar Associations can be real important factors in that. So the other thing we have on here is recruiting and hiring pledges. Touched on this a little bit. Being based in Maine, where the state's population is particularly homogenous, I think adds some complexity to how Veral Dana can address the incoming pipeline diversity issue. I think it's not an excuse, but it is hard to attract diverse candidates to Portland, Maine. That is the headquarters of our firm. That's where our summer associate program is based, and the expectation is that particularly junior attorneys would practice there first. There's obviously flexibility to come to Boston or Westport or other offices, but I think that is the core of our firm's headquarters. So I think one of the things that in looking around in Portland, and I think it's quite unique, I think there's a number of law firms who have diversity fellowships and kind of have 1L programs where they bring in diverse candidates earlier in their law school career before the 2L summer to kind of get that exposure. But I think what Dana has done that is unique, it's partnered with two other firms in Maine, Pierce Atwood and Bernstein Schur, to bring 1Ls to Maine in a collaborative way, which I think is unique in that they're competitors in their day-to-day practice, right? But I think what the program is trying to do is understand that no one firm can solve this problem by itself, and that the goal is to diversify the legal bar, like the bar in Maine, and kind of have a more diverse legal community writ large. And so the program is geared to 1L students who are members of historically underrepresented groups in the legal profession. It's a 10-week paid internship targeting 6 1Ls, 2 at each firm. And in addition to the substantive legal experience that they will get as part of the summer associate program, they're treated just like the 2L summers in the respective firms' summer associate programs, and kind of do all of the same substantive work, same as, assignments, assignment coordinators, same social events and other development events. But there's another component, which is that there's some joint programming amongst the 3 firms, so that those 6 1Ls also have an opportunity to build relationships with each other. And the goal is, and I think the program is just in its 2nd year, but the goal is to also get buy-in and participation from companies and legal departments within Maine, and kind of get them exposure, the students exposure to potential clients and bar associations and others in Maine, such that students have an experience where they, have a positive career, view that as a potential avenue for their career, returning to Maine. And I think pretty novel in that the firms have, they do the solicitation, hiring, interviewing kind of jointly. So that's unique, and I think we had 1 summer associate in the program last year. It's growing to 2 at each firm. And my sense from Jennifer is that she had a really good experience and became very close with one of the 1Ls at the other firms, and really took advantage of all of the programming. So, that's not going to solve the problem, but I think it's a way to try to attract more diverse talent to a geographic area of the country where there may not be a pool to draw from. And then I think I'm also on hiring committee at the firm, and I think thinking about not recruiting, obviously we're in New England and there's lots of good law schools here, and that's typically where law firms in Boston draw, and New England draw from. Thinking about how to recruit from other law schools that are not the go-to to get talented, diverse candidates. I think the schools here, there's a small pool, and all of the firms here are competing for the same, however, handful of candidates who have lots of options, which is wonderful for them, but it doesn't mean that all the firms will have good representation. And so thinking outside of the box a little bit, and going to schools that may be in the Midwest or elsewhere where you get, the same caliber of candidates, and it's just kind of outside of your normal kind of purview of where you would go to. So I think those are some of the things we are trying. And I said, as we think that we have a real success story to tell on the gender diversity side, and trying to figure out how to use learnings from that to shape continued efforts around ethnic and LGBTQ and other types of diversity. So I think, was there anything else on that you wanted to say?
No, that was great.
So takeaways. I guess we'll walk through these, but obviously been open to questions too. But do you want?
Sure. Yeah. So obviously, what we talked about, diversity and inclusion is imperative for businesses and law firms to succeed. And I think if you don't take this seriously, you're gonna fall behind. And I think one of the reasons why Barrel was successful, or has been very successful with respect to gender diversity, is because it started early. I think it recognized, early relative to others, right?
Yeah.
It recognized the business case for gender diversity, just diversity in general, but it recognized that with respect to gender, it had a very strong foundation, and it really attacked the issue. And that's sort of, I think, part of the takeaway that I've gotten. progress is, just from the charts and from what we've talked about, this is a highly complex issue, as you all know, and there are different parts of the pipeline to address, but progress is being made. I think we see that from the numbers, but obviously there's a lot more work to be done.
So yeah, understand where you are and set achievable goals. I think this is really important, and it goes to kind of this self-awareness and maybe self-evaluation that's kind of in the next bullet point, but kind of draw on your strengths. I think Farrell really embraced that early on, given just its history and how women were in leadership ranks early on. And I think use where you have strengths to expand on your program. And it's a really multifaceted issue, and so not trying to tackle all of it at once. I think it's good to make progress and declare success where you can and keep working on it. The point below that, self-evaluation is critical to achieve buy-in. I think, and some of the folks in the first panel touched on this a little bit. I think it's important to be in touch and shape your programming by the voices from the population you're targeting. So to the extent you have diverse attorneys in your ranks, to be listening to them, whether it's through formal surveys and they're anonymous, or it's small focus group style, or it's having a lunch where the executive board or the practice group chairs, or just kind of have a forum to have people say, this is what I've seen worked, or my friend at this firm does this, I'd like to try that here. Or I think really tapping into the folks who are most affected by this programming is important. And that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think that's kind of both for types of diversity. So what works for women may not work for ethnic and racial diversity or LGBTQ issues. But also there's not a one-size-fits-all for law firms, whether it be by size or given what your natural culture is and where you have strengths, there may be things that just work more organically in your firm, and there doesn't need to be as much formal programming around it. There's other things that you may have a weakness, and I think that's why the self-evaluation part is critical, to find out where your weaknesses are and try to attack that first. And then monitor rigorously, I think this is the last point, because it's really the important. I don't think you ever arrive, right? You have to constantly be creating metrics, measuring success, and holding firm leadership accountable is key. And I think every firm has to figure out how they can implement that. I think practice group leaders, at least in our firm, not just for diversity, but are kind of a pressure point to drive behavior and motivate behavior amongst the ranks. And I think to the extent that someone in that position can be accountable for other things like this, is one way to approach that. I think Raquel talked about, also addressing comp. And I think, at our firm and others, I know a lot of you partners, you kind of do an end of the year memo, or even at the beginning, you do a business development plan, and maybe really evaluating kind of diversity initiatives that you've taken on for yourself is part of that, is another way to think about accountability. So I think it's just continually evaluating and measuring, so that the folks who are the target of your programming feel that you are listening and that you are putting into action kind of what you're learning. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all we have, but open to questions.
I just want to add on to what you were saying, and then I have a question.
Sure.
One of the things is communicating. So when you ask for feedback, it's really important, I believe, and experience, that it's critical to communicate what the results were and the progress that you're making on a regular basis, not just a one-off, so that people know that you really have heard, and that they know that their suggestions or feedback is actually going to be put into action. So I just wanted to add that as a takeaway, that if you just take the information and you don't report back and you don't report progress, it can be really deadly. But now the question I have is, when you talk about, and I'm not in the legal profession, so this is probably going, so just know that. What is the diversity, or what is the representation within the law schools themselves? And are the firms reflecting the same type of proportion, or where do they stand juxtaposed to the firms, the schools themselves?
I think that's a good question. I think on gender, I think law schools are becoming majority female
yes.
to some degree. Obviously, I think ethnic diversity still lags.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of kind of
Trying to see if I have the
trending?
numbers.
Yeah.
But what I can say is that, and that we sort of talked about this whole, diversity is being invited, to the party, but not, inclusion is being, asked to dance, right? The law firms associate and summer associate classes are very, very diverse, and it doesn't. I don't think it still reflects the population necessarily, or but compared to partnership numbers, it drops significantly.
No, that I understand, but I'm just taking it back even further
Sure.
to the source. What type you draw from the law schools and other professions. I'm just curious about really what is the makeup of the students in the law, on the law track.
Yeah, I don't know if folks from Suffolk can answer that. Do you have a sense of how the trends are? And I know there's a lot of programs. Law schools are also focused on this. I think one of the things we didn't mention with the main diverse summer associate program is that University of Maine Law School is actually also a partner of that program, and looking at it to try to increase its diversity at the school. And so they're providing some administrative support to collaborate the firms, but also intend to have programming at their school that will involve their students and prospective students as well, as a way to tackle this as a main Portland focused issue, and not just a law firm problem, a law school problem. But I do think law schools across the country are also trying to work to increase diversity in their ranks as well.
Yeah, so I don't know numbers off of the top of my head, but what I can say is that the numbers for gender diversity are up. Here at Suffolk, we are a majority woman school right now, and so we have more women incoming students than men. In terms of racial diversity, it ebbs and flows. Those numbers are still just as they are in the practice, low. And that doesn't mean that people aren't applying, but then there's also some issues as it relates to the barriers of actual admittance, whether that's the LSAT or GPA, things of that nature that then also become a barrier that we find for racial diverse students. But as the panelist said, we're definitely doing our part across the nation to kind of figure out what we can be doing more to help that pipeline.
Thank you.
Other questions?